I guess I'll just get started. My name is Bradley Hope. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and recently co-wrote this book, Billion Dollar Whale, about the 1MDB scandal, and with a big focus on the Malaysian financier at the middle of it, called Jho Low. I found, throughout my career in journalism that I was always dealing with a lot of fragments. You get a sense of a big scandal, but you don't know what's really going on. You just get to see bits and pieces of it. A good example is this Danske Bank scandal that's been going on. We know there's $200 billion that flowed through this particular branch in Estonia, but we don't know where the money came from or where it's going. And similarly with the Panama Papers, it always felt to me like a very vast but very shallow sea of information. We know that lots of people are using the offshore world for different purposes, but we don't really know, in a lot of those cases, what was the actual story behind the money. For me, the 1MDB scandal is really, it's kind of the opposite. It's a very deep and explanatory and narrative example of money laundering, of the use of offshore havens, of abuses of various tools of the financial system. So I'll just give you a quick overview of it. So this guy is Jho Low. He's an incredible figure because he basically graduated from the Wharton School of Business and never had a real job in his life. He went straight from Wharton to becoming sort of a private equity fund founder, and he didn't have any real credentials in the financial world. He just became essentially what you would see as like a wheeler dealer or an intermediary kind of character, and he didn't have much of a global profile, but he went to these schools. He went to Harrow and Wharton, and in those places he met a lot of people from royal families, from the Gulf countries and other places, and that was that was his first seed of how he began to develop what would be his sort of way into making a lot of money. He also became very close with the first family of Malaysia at the time. This is Rasma Mansor. She was the first lady. She was the first lady until earlier this year, and her husband is Najib Razak. And both of them are now in Malaysia, subject to multiple criminal charges with money laundering. And they found in her home alone just an extraordinary cachet of jewelry and handbags. I think it was more than 400 handbags. Each of them could be $10,000 or $12,000 a piece. And one detail that stuck out for me, she had 14 tiaras, which just seemed to me one tiara too many, because it's not every month that you need a tiara. But so he had these relationships with the young, wealthy Gulf people. He had relationship with the first family of Malaysia, and he was really inspired by a visit to Abu Dhabi, which he had very early on in his career, where he met this guy. This is Yusuf Al-Otaiba. He's the current the UAE ambassador to the U.S. So Jho Low showed up in Abu Dhabi at a time when Abu Dhabi wasn't really on the map, and he could see that there were some exciting things going on there. There was obviously a lot of money, and he met this guy, and he was really inspired by a sovereign wealth fund called Mubadala. And what was different about Mubadala than other sovereign wealth funds is the obvious kind of comparable would be Adia, which is this really the savings account of the UAE. They take the excess oil revenue and they put it into this fund. It invests passively. It's not that exciting, to be honest. But Mubadala was something different. It was a sovereign wealth fund. It had the backing of the state, but it borrowed money, and it did these sort of strategic projects. So they were trying to bring microchip manufacturing to Abu Dhabi, and they were building a new financial center. It was this idea of driving particular sectors. So Jho Low was really inspired by that, and he got into his mind that he wanted to create something similar in Malaysia. And the way he did that was he started out creating something like that in one of these oil-rich. I'm thinking a bit of feedback, so let's come over here. Yeah, sure.
Is there a Sean Cordes in here? No? Does anyone know Sean Cordes? All right, thank you.
No problem. So he actually initially helped create one of these sovereign wealth funds, the very beginnings of it, in one of these oil-rich provinces of Malaysia. But at the last minute, the Sultan of that province decided he didn't want to do it anymore. But Jho Low decided to press the button anyway on borrowing $1 billion. So suddenly there was this fund. The patron didn't want it because he decided at the last minute he didn't want it. But Jho Low had already borrowed the $1 billion. So he turned to Najib and Rasma and said that this could be rebranded as their sovereign wealth fund, a federal sovereign wealth fund. And that was the birth of One Malaysia development. And One Malaysia was also, as you can see on their shirts, that was sort of the electoral slogan of Najib when he was running for office. So they had $1 billion, and it's hard to, I can't explain to you exactly what was going on in Jho Low's head, but very clearly from all of the court documents that have come out and our interviews and others, he wanted to gain control of that money outside of the Malaysian context. So the first deal this fund did, within not long of being created, was related to this guy. This is Prince Turki bin Abdullah Al Saud. He's one of the sons of King Abdullah. And he was sort of the name on this little company called Petrol Saudi. It sounded pretty grand. It had a great website. But Petrol Saudi was essentially just a shell of a company. It was an introduction business. They were using his name to help others potentially enter Saudi Arabia or do deals with Saudi Arabia. So on its surface, it looked like it was a real oil company. And the deal that was constructed, and we have a lot of the material around this because later on a whistleblower released the entire email archive of Petrol Saudi during this period. So you can see the deal constructed. What they did was created a joint venture. And the idea was Malaysia was going to give that $1 billion that it had, and this company was going to contribute its assets, which at that point in time were really just options on a few oil and gas fields. And they did a rushed audit or evaluation of those assets over like a course of a few days that justified that they were contributing enough to this joint venture. And then it's almost kind of hard to believe, but the paperwork for the deal said $1 billion. And then the actual final paperwork said $300 million will go to the joint venture and $700 million will go to this other company. And it said that other company had extended a loan to the joint venture, and this was paying that loan off. In fact, that other company didn't even fully exist at the time that they say that there was a loan extended. There was no loan extended. And that $700 million went from, so Jho Low went from a relatively wealthy young guy to suddenly having $700 million of cash through a Seychelles company that he had set up. And it obviously didn't go to the joint venture as intended. That was the beginning of it. And within weeks and months, he was living up to what became his reputation as a whale. A whale is a term of art for nightclubs, for somebody who can come in and make the numbers for the club over a period of a few days. And Jho Low eventually became one of the world's biggest spenders. At nightclubs and casinos, he has spent at certain nightclubs $2 million in one night on champagne, and it's actually kind of hard to spend that much money in one night. So they had actually, we've spoken to some of the people in clubs in New York City, said they had to kind of invent additional features to be able to get the numbers up that high. So not just buying the finest champagne, but they had to kind of create a sort of circus around it. So there's this thing called bottle parades, where women came out dressed skimpily carrying the bottles, and that kind of added some additional, $50,000 to the equation. This is a kind of a rare picture of Jho in a casino. He's a big gambler, but this is the only photo I've ever seen of him in an actual casino, and his game of choice was baccarat, of course. He also immediately, and it's kind of amazing. He went from to suddenly having this $700 million under his control, and he just immediately went to work on spending it. This is detailed really in extraordinary detail in the DOJ filings, where I think it was over the course of 5 months, spent $85 million. And actually, one of the earliest publications that really caught on to this was the New York Post. Their page 6 has this most amazing article that is so prescient if you read it now, where they talk about they paint a picture of this like young guy who showed up in New York. He was traveling around New York City in a flotilla of Escalades. All of his friends in different Escalades. They were renting an apartment that was $100,000 a month. And then he rented a few other apartments at similar price in the same building just for all the friends to kind of overflow into, going to these nightclubs, spending all this money. And he also was spending a lot of money getting celebrities to hang out with him. So people like Paris Hilton, he was spending $100,000 for her to come hang out for a party, or maybe even more than that for a period of time. She also would be given, if she would join him in a casino, she would be given chips to gamble with, and she could keep the proceeds. A lot of those proceeds are now being sought by the government. He also became close with Leonardo DiCaprio very early on. Within just months of showing up in New York, and through these nightlife connections, he was introduced to Leonardo DiCaprio. And in his case, I've never heard of him being paid to attend a party, but Jho Low offered this amazing opportunity to fund films. So The Wolf of Wall Street was something that Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese had wanted to make for a long time, but the Hollywood studios had decided it was just too risky. It was very R-rated, and they just thought it wouldn't work out. So in came Jho Low with his friends, including the stepson of the prime minister that we had saw before, and they were ready to write a check for $100 million to fund that film. And in the last couple of years, the DOJ filed a lawsuit to seize the profits that were due to that film, saying that the money was stolen. And Red Granite actually settled that lawsuit and paid $60 million to the government. It's obviously a little bit ironic that the film Wolf of Wall Street was funded by this money. And I even heard an anecdote that really stuck with me was, at one point, Jho Low was sitting at a lunch table in like one of these really fancy Italian restaurants in New York, and there was Jordan Belfort, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jho Low, and like other hangers-on, and they were just listening in rapt attention of Jordan Belfort telling stories about how he did it and what he did and how crazy it was, and Jho Low was completely silent. Meanwhile, Jordan Belfort's scam is like peanuts compared to the 1MDB scandal, which is, the different governments around the world saying upwards of $5 billion went missing. And there's even potentially more money that went missing. It's really hard to figure out the full number of it. But I mean, it was a lot more than Jordan Belfort, that's for sure. Jho Low also dated supermodels like Miranda Kerr. And in fact, she's had to embarrassingly turn over a lot of the diamonds she received to the government. And Jho Low also, during that period, was one of the world's biggest investors in luxury real estate. So he bought the penthouse on the right tower there that used to be owned by Beyonce and Jay-Z. And that was just one of like maybe 6 or 7 really high-end, multi-tens of millions of dollars pieces of real estate that he owned in New York City at different points. And it's quite interesting as well because a lot of the real estate would transfer between people. So, for example, that stepson of the prime minister, Riza Aziz, he, at one point, Jho Low transferred ownership of one of these luxury pieces of real estate to him, and they just changed the shell company. It came out in this really great New York Times story that kind of examined it. But, the other thing about the 1MDB scandal for me is that Jho Low, when he began this journey as a 20-something guy with getting access to that $1 billion, he wasn't very good at all of this. I mean, he used his real name on shell companies. He didn't have proxies. And over time, the sophistication grew. But if you follow the case, it's really an amazing lesson in how the world really works. Just to see him kind of fumbling his way through the mechanisms of money laundering and hiding your name from assets. And so there's a lot of interesting leakage if you look at it over time, because you can just really understand how he was setting things up. And by the end of it, and today, we don't know how he's moving money around anymore. So he's learned a lot since the beginning. Obviously, and this has been in the news a lot recently, Goldman Sachs played a pivotal role in the 1MDB scandal. This guy on the right is Tim Leister. He was the relationship manager, and he ran the Hong Kong investment banking division of Goldman Sachs. And it's now emerged, and we didn't really know the full extent of this before, that he was involved with Jho Low from the very beginning in a scheme to pay bribes to different officials, including people in Abu Dhabi and in Malaysia. And he pled guilty to this just the other day, and he's going to be sentenced in January. And he's obviously a cooperating witness in the case. And what was pretty startling in these recent court filings is the U.S. government was really portraying Goldman as being reckless and irresponsible with how they were, involved in this, and they described the culture of the Hong Kong office and how multiple people, not just him, there's another guy that was arrested in Malaysia. They're trying to extradite him to the U.S. Another guy was put on leave that was a very senior banker. The other prong of this that maybe in a way is not as well understood is this Abu Dhabi element. So that first deal involved this Petrol Saudi company, so that was $1 billion, and eventually it was $1.8 billion was taken through that mechanism. The second part was through this guy. He's called Hadam al-Kubaisi. He was a larger-than-life character as well. He was kind of the impresario of this giant nightclub empire in Las Vegas. He was involved in huge deals for the sovereign wealth fund called IPIC. They bailed out Barclays. They invested in Daimler, Unicredit. So he was a big character, and he was really a sought-after person for all the big bankers as well. So Jho Low got linked up with him, and so the second part of the second heist, as we like to say, involved 1MDB used Goldman to raise money in the form of bonds, and it's amazing. This really goes to why Goldman, missed a lot of red flags. They were raising all this money. Goldman was being paid about 10 to 11% of the value of the bonds for raising this money. The way they did that was they explained to 1MDB, if you want to raise this money quickly and quietly, then this is what it's going to cost. So here's your menu of options. If you want to raise it the traditional way, it's going to be 1%. It's going to take a lot longer. But if you want to raise it quickly and quietly, then we can do 10%. And so imagine that you are raising $3.5 billion of bonds. Eventually, it became $6.5 billion of bonds. You pay 10% to Goldman, and then hidden in the documents was that they got IPIC to guarantee the 1MDB bonds. In exchange for that, they transferred all this money over time. 2.4 billion of that 6.5 went to Abu Dhabi to a company that was affiliated with Abu Dhabi as kind of a deposit that Abu Dhabi just got to hold for a period of time. So $6.5 billion raised, 650 paid out in fees to Goldman, 2.4 paid out in the form of a collateral or deposit. There's not that much money left over in the end. So it didn't even look commercially feasible. So this guy, and then what actually happened was that money that was transferred to the Abu Dhabi affiliate was a shell company set up to look like a real Abu Dhabi company. And that company was controlled by Joe and this guy and another guy. And from there, it went to these other companies that just kind of distributed the money to everyone. And in his case, he received about $500 million of that stolen money. And he used it to pay down the loan of this super yacht called the Topaz that was owned by Sheikh Mansour, who's one of the most powerful people in Abu Dhabi, and by other luxury real estate. The other feature of this is obviously the role of Swiss banks, but not just Swiss banks, it's the Singapore branches of Swiss banks. That's really where all the action happened. Very early on, that Petrol Saudi deal, they were trying to find a bank, and they initially attempted to use this bank called BSI. It's a small Swiss private bank that really catered to Italian customers, but BSI actually initially turned them down because of the role of Jho Low. Ironically, later on, they were able to almost take over BSI. Jho Low became the key client of BSI. Every single family member and friend had accounts there, and there was a lot of transfers between them. All these banks have been sanctioned extensively, and some of the bankers have actually gone to jail in Singapore. The other thing about the 1MDB story that makes it kind of exciting is it's not just like a quick bank robbery, so to speak. It just keeps going. So Jho Low was always trying to impress people and to put himself between them and to make himself invaluable. And so here we have Najib playing golf with Barack Obama. There's no indication that Jho Low set this up, but he liked to tell people he did. But more importantly, Jho Low did actually use his funds to be able to gain access to the White House. He started this whole business franchise with a former top Obama fundraiser, and it involved paying this guy, $10 million over a matter of months to do some research into what Malaysia could do better with the U.S. And then not long after that, Leonardo DiCaprio and Riza Aziz were visiting Obama in the Oval Office and handing him an early copy of The Wolf of Wall Street. So he really had these ambitious way of spending money, and it actually had some impacts. A lot of what we know about 1MDB, especially that early phase, came from this guy. He's called Xavier Justo. He leaked a lot of material to this investigative website called Sarawak Report. She did a lot of amazing work, especially in those early days. And it led to this entire crazy drama where, so basically, essentially, this guy was trying to, he had a falling out with Petrol Saudi, and he was trying to sell the entire email archive of Petrol Saudi, which he had taken upon leaving the company. And Sarawak Report and these Malaysian journalists had kind of made promises to him that he'd be paid money, and he decided to leak it over. He actually never did get paid. So they started publishing all these articles, and then soon after, there's he was sitting in Thailand, where that's his wife, where they were building this hotel, when like 20 or 30 police officers descended on him, arrested him, and he was held in prison for, I think, almost 2 years. And the part of it that's really crazy is that the guys from Petrol Saudi had this kind of enormous sway over the actual prison. They controlled who he met with. They arranged journalists to fly in and for him to kind of confess things that weren't true. It's really incredible. And he's actually filed a lot of suits in Switzerland and the UK now to seek justice. Eventually, he was released after serving that time with the help of the Swiss government. In the Wall Street Journal, we've played a big role in covering 1MDB. Obviously, there's others. The New York Times wrote a really great story early on as well. But we started off on the story from this point, actually, in 2013. Some of my colleagues wrote about these huge profits to Goldman, and it really just kind of stuck out. It didn't make a lot of sense. This story came about because some of the Goldman guys were just bragging about how big their Malaysia business was. And at the time, it wasn't clear that it was connected, but it started to implant itself in the minds of Wall Street Journal editors and reporters. And the big thing that came was this one here. So a few months later, some of the Malaysian investigators that had been looking into this stuff themselves leaked to the Wall Street Journal that the Prime Minister of Malaysia had received $681 million into his personal private bank account. Later on, it became clear that he actually received about $1 billion. And at the time, it was kind of interesting. There's all these things. It was kind of like an archipelago of scandals that you kind of had the feeling connected at the core, but you didn't really know. So at that time, this was actually a separate to 1MDB. This was just the Prime Minister of Malaysia received money in his accounts. There was the Goldman Sachs thing going on. There was the Sarawak Report disclosures around Xavier Justo and Petrol Saudi, and they all seemed connected, but at that time they weren't entirely clearly connected. Later on, thanks to especially the DOJ, it made clear that all of that money, the $681 million, and much of the other money was actually, it came out of 1MDB through those Petrol Saudi and Abu Dhabi mechanisms, and through a kind of a maze of offshore companies ended up in his private accounts. And this obviously led to a huge conflict with his government, not by the journal's choice, but we wrote our stories and sought comment from him like you would do in responsible journalism, but they made it into a whole scandal about how the Wall Street Journal was publishing false information, and they actually, the guy that wrote the press releases is this British guy called Paul Statlin. He was a former APCO person, and he actually wrote the press releases, and actually, ironically now, Malaysia now is seeking his arrest. The other thing that's kind of amazing about this is, if you think about the amount of money that went missing, you'd think people would want it back, But Najib had received his share. His stepson had received. So Najib received close to $1 billion in his account. He sent some of the money back, but still it's about 300-something million. And he used it for electoral, to buy votes, essentially, to, do campaigning in areas where he was trying to improve his standing. His stepson received $240 million. His wife received all these jewels. In Abu Dhabi, this guy, his yacht was partly paid. This is Sheikh Mansour. His yacht was partly paid for by the money. So everyone, in a way, because everyone had received so much money and had been so touched by this experience, I mean, in some people's lives were completely changed. Some of these, imagine, one of these people that got to work with Jho Low and suddenly they're having tens of millions of dollars, and before they were just a salaried person. So in a way, that is what's kind of protracted this experience. This whole scandal blew up in 2015, and here we are in 2018 is really starting to come home to roost. But I think that's kind of a key element to this, was how much money was paid out to other people. We relied a lot on different kinds of documents, and this is an example of, very early on, we gained access to a lot of the 1MDB board minutes, and they were extremely useful, and it really showed the role of the Prime Minister and all actions of the fund. He would say on television, "Oh, I was just chairman of the board of advisors," but actually he signed every single document there, so that's why he's in so much trouble right now. The biggest moment probably in the 1MDB case came when the Department of Justice launched its initial civil asset forfeiture cases, and they went after, I think initially about $1 billion of assets, and now it's closer to $2 billion. So they've gone after the yachts, the luxury real estate, the Wolf of Wall Street, and this was their largest ever kleptocracy case. That was in 2016. There was a lot of protests in Malaysia, but ultimately it didn't really hit until earlier this year when Najib was voted out of office. And even he admits now that the 1MDB scandal was the reason for that, although he continues to say that he had no idea that any of the money was stolen. So some of the things that's on the horizon now, Goldman itself is a target in the Justice Department investigation. They've got a guilty plea from one of the partners of Goldman. They've arrested another one. The U.S. is trying to figure out, is Goldman, I think the negotiations are kind of centering on it, is Goldman going to plead guilty itself to a crime or one of its subsidiaries, or, and I think Goldman's kind of trying to keep it on the civil track. Singapore, there's still more to come. Then the other kind of, the most recent element of this is, where is Jho Low? Around 2015, he sort of stopped traveling as much. He had lived this crazy life where he had a private jet, and he would circumnavigate the globe like every few weeks. I think the number, I think he actually had on staff like 4 captains and like 8 crew, just full-time for Jho Low as he traveled around the world. But then he slowed down, and he started to stay in Asia. And what's really emerged recently is this incredible new chapter, which is that while in China, he developed these relationships with officials there, and Najib, in this vulnerable state, he's denying any money is missing, but he needs to plug the hole. Jho helped arrange for China to do these giant infrastructure deals in Malaysia and overpay for them. This is what the Malaysian government's alleged, in order to plug those holes. And so he became essentially a very powerful Chinese intelligence asset. And it's unclear where he is at any given moment, but he's been living in China a lot and has some degree of protection from them. Malaysia has sort of, through its back channels, confronted China about that, and I feel like there's more to come on that front. And then the U.S. is separately investigating Elliot Brody. It turns out that his U.S. strategy, which is, again, very brazen and very bold, was to hire as many people that were close to Donald Trump as possible. So he got with Elliot Brody, who is one of the Republican fundraisers. One of the documents that leaked from that was that Elliot Brody and his wife would be paid, I think, around $8 million non-refundable retainer, and there was a tens of millions of dollars in success fee if he would successfully lobby the U.S. government to drop its criminal investigation of Jho Low. More recently, we've learned that he also hired Mark Kassovitz, one of Trump's lawyers, Bobby Birchfield, who was an ethics lawyer for Donald Trump, and there's one more, isn't there? Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, is his civil lawyer. We have a Schillings representative here, or former Schillings and now Kobre and Kim for Jho Low in the audience, so maybe she could explain more about it. But it's just incredible. It's incredible to see this stuff keep unfolding. And I think what really impresses me about Jho Low is he's so busy. Every day of his life, he's so busy. He's got all of his phones in front of him, and he's just constantly doing more deals, doing more transactions. And it takes us, as journalists and perhaps law enforcement, it takes us months to catch up with like a few days of work of Jho Low. But it's still a fascinating experience, and I feel like it's kind of changed my life in a way because I had always gone after these fragmentary cases and never really saw the full picture until, because of his sort of fumbling nature in the early days, but also his ambitious nature, I was able to see something go from the beginning to the end, and we're not near the end yet, but just to see the whole life of a scandal like this. So that's the gist of my talk, but maybe it'd be better to do some questions if anybody has one.
Thank you. I think Bloomberg reported the other day that he met with Lloyd Blankfein, and I'm wondering if you envision any further implication of Blankfein, and is there any, what kind of exposure he might have under these circumstances?
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem for Goldman is not so much one individual's meeting like that. I mean, I think Lloyd was in a room with him, and it's really about the processes that Goldman were going through. So Jho Low was repeatedly trying to get an account at Goldman and the personal wealth division, and they kept denying him. They're like, there's no way we're going to deal with this guy. Meanwhile, Jho Low is clearly involved with all these other transactions, and the real question is, what did Lloyd know about what Goldman had on Jho Low, the due diligence side, and meanwhile they're having these meetings. And I think the reason that Goldman is itself in trouble is because there were so many times where not only Jho Low as well, also this guy Kadam al-Kubaisi, he was very well known for asking for kickbacks. There's even U.S. lawsuits where he's asking for like a $500 million kickback, and somebody's disclosing this in court. So Goldman was dealing with these characters who were pretty unsavory, and even at the time by their own estimation, and yet these deals move forward. Another example for Goldman is one of these bond deals, 1MDB said, look, when we raise the money, we'd like you to deposit it in our private Swiss bank account. BSI didn't do a lot of sovereign wealth fund, management of funds. So, and one of Goldman's lawyers even raised the question, why this doesn't look right? 1MDB shouldn't have a Swiss bank account in this strange bank. It should have an established bank account. And so I think those are the reasons why they're under a lot of scrutiny. And it's not just Lloyd, it's everybody else, Gary Cohn, all these guys were on the committee meetings where they were approving the deals, where they're like, okay, we're going to take 10%, and here's why. And there's even this one anecdote where after they raised $3.5 billion of bonds, within months, not even a whole year, Najib actually went up to a Goldman official, I think at Davos, and said, by the way, I think we'd like to raise another $3 billion as quickly and quietly as possible. And this, again, the commercial rationale of this little fund amassing all this debt, and actually all that debt became a huge problem for 1MDB as well, because their interest payments were crazy. And at one point, they had no cash in the fund. They had to raise more money just to be able to pay the interest payments. So they had no reasonable business going on. So thank you.
Yeah, excuse me. Certainly couldn't miss this one. Ewan Grant Institute for Statecraft. I was at a wedding in Kuala Lumpur in January, and the main topic of conversation from the bride's father and uncle was asking me what people in Europe were saying about 1MDB. They only started talking about the wedding at the reception, the wedding ceremony. It was all about 1MDB. My question is based on a very interesting comment you made, where the suggestion that Jho Low is an intelligence asset for the Chinese, and you mentioned back channels by the new Malaysian government. What kind of a chance do you think it is that Jho Low will be returned to Malaysia? And if so, what will the Chinese expect in return? I noticed that the new government in Kuala Lumpur has cancelled or postponed a number of likely very Chinese-friendly infrastructure projects, like the high-speed rail link to Singapore, but on the other hand has also announced naval exercises with the Chinese west of Singapore, not east. So it does rather suggest there's a lot of horse trading going on. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's unclear if there would ever be such a deal. I think, my speculation would be that China would want to save face in the experience. So if Jho Low is a Chinese intelligence asset and he knows ways and means of Chinese intelligence, he knows what he's himself been involved in, he's a pretty big risk to hand over to anyone, and including Malaysia, in this case, very confrontational relationship. The only thing that Malaysia could really offer is to, like you say, renegotiate these contracts in a way that they saw fit, but also allowed China to continue to have the project. If they cancel the projects outright, I think it's just a huge blow to China because, this signature One Belt, One Road infrastructure development around the world is quickly becoming a big black eye for China. You've seen in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Argentina, so many places Pakistan, where the One Belt, One Road on its surface is supposed to be about spreading infrastructure around the world, but it turns out there's always some kind of a side story to it, where in the case of Sri Lanka, they over-indebted Sri Lanka. They couldn't afford a port that didn't make commercial sense, and now China owns the port. And guess what? The port is just big enough to handle Chinese frigate. So I think China would be in a desperate bid right now to make these deals not go that direction, not get exposed for the full nature of what they were designed for, which was to kick back money to Najib in order to plug these 1MDB holes. And in exchange, Najib was essentially giving up his sovereignty to China. That's why you found, even in the first days of Mahathir's reemergence as prime minister, he described these deals with China as unequal treaties, which is the same terminology that was used with China and the British in the colonial era. So essentially calling out China was involved in debt imperialism. So I think it's a big deal. And it shows why this scandal doesn't sort of just stay as a financial scandal or have to do with thefts or anything. It keeps kind of pulling the dark fabric away from all these things that are really fascinating to understand and uncover. Anyone else? There's one.
When different people are fined by the US or they recover the money, does the US Department of Justice keep it for the American state, or is it returned to the Malaysians? Because we are talking about very large sums here. Because of the losses to their budget, I mean, it's partly the politicians' shtick, but they are saying because of 1MDB, our budget is $3 billion in deficit, whatever.
Yeah.
Do you know if the DOJ has any plans to, as it were, repatriate any of this money?
Yes. So that's the idea of this kleptocracy initiative. If they seize an asset and they win the case, which we haven't seen, like all we've seen is the seizure themselves or the freezing of the assets. They haven't been litigated yet. Jho Low has never laid out a defense in any substantive form. So what they do is they've seized it. Their long-term goal would be to sell it and then take that money, keep it in a single pot, and return it to Malaysia in some way or another. Now, when Najib was still in power, it would be inconceivable they would return the money there. So in that case, they would have, if he had remained in power for decades, they would have come up with some other way to give the benefit to Malaysia. But I think now that there's a new government that's pursuing these cases more transparently, they might just return the cash. But that's a very long-term process. I don't think that would happen very quickly. And actually, you can see Malaysia kind of circumvented the process a little bit because the U.S. had filed to seize this yacht called the Equanimity. It was a $250 million yacht. And then Malaysia kind of instituted its own process where they convinced the Indonesian authorities to hand over the yacht. And there's been a lot of kind of noise around this. And now they're selling the yacht. So they're trying to do it faster, because they don't want to wait that 7 years it might take for the case to reach a resolution. I think one of Jho Low's big strategies was, in order to make all this go away, the criminal cases, he was willing to walk away from all these assets, and just allow the U.S. to seize them and liquidate them and give it back to Malaysia. But he wanted in exchange for that to not be criminally prosecuted and for it to be all over. But it just doesn't work that way, I guess.
Thank you. Can you tell us more about the whistleblower in terms of what information, where was he positioned? How did he come to get the information? And clearly there's the role of a media outlet that you're talking about. Some investigative journalist was on this. Can you kind of tell us about that archipelago, as you were saying?
Yeah. So the website is called Sarawak Report. She is a British journalist. She used to work in places like BBC, I believe. She left the kind of official world journalism and created this website that was devoted to Sarawak, which is a region of Malaysia. It was originally kind of like environmental activism, but it turns out that the kind of corruption in Sarawak bridged over and connected to Jho Low and to other things, and she kind of developed sources in Malaysia that helped her get on this trail. She was really the first one to blaze a trail in the beginning of this. So along the way, it turns out, some Malaysians met. So it's a parallel story. Petrol Saudi gets all this money, the 700 million. This 300 million, and they also get money from the 700 million. And they start to build Petrol Saudi. They want to make it into a real company. So Tariq Obaid, one of the co-founders of Petrol Saudi, gets an old friend of his called Xavier Justo to join the company. And he was supposed to be kind of a man about, a jack of all trades at the company and do different things. So over the course of a year, that relationship frayed because, according to Xavier, the money went to the guy's head and he became impossible to deal with. And they had a very fractious breakup. And as he was leaving, he took a copy of all of the emails of this company. So then for several years, those emails don't come out. But along the way, actually, strangely enough, he went to a Formula One race to kind of negotiate in Singapore, to negotiate with Petrol Saudi over a severance that he felt he was owed. The Petrol Saudi guys didn't show up. So he's just hanging out at Formula One. And at that Formula One in Singapore were all these Malaysian people. And they got to talking to him. And they knew about Petrol Saudi. They'd seen the deal with 1MDB. There was a lot of noise about 1MDB. Was there something going on? And he sort of related, like, yeah, there was a lot going on, And so those Malaysians passed the phone number of Xavier Justo to Claire at the Sarawak Report. So she called him, she met him, she convinced him, along with another journalist outlet in Malaysia called The Edge, to hand over the hard drive. And so the hard drive, and to be honest, he's not your typical whistleblower, because he really expected to be paid instantly for this information. I think Petrol Saudi has kind of made a case that he was extorting them. But he actually didn't go to them and say, if you don't give me the money, I'm going to release this. He just tried to sell the information to someone else. And that email hard drive was literally every employee's email for like a period of a year and a half. It's an incredible resource, but very difficult to go through, as I experienced about a year ago, where I went through like 300,000 emails. But there is some very good stuff in there. So that's the gist of it.
Thanks, Bradley. The English law firm Schillings is set to represent Jho Low. Schillings is here today, scribbling down everything you're saying. Can you tell us a little bit about your interaction with Schillings and what actions they've taken, and the extent to which that's made it more difficult to report on the story?
Well, the Wall Street Journal has a policy called no surprises journalism. And in general, we try to pride ourselves on never being agenda-driven as an organization. So, every article we've written about 1MDB goes through an incredible, expensive array of procedures. We write the story. We have an editor who edits it, another editor above him, and we have a team of lawyers called the vetters, and a team of lawyers and a team of editors called vetters, and they all read every story. So it's a expensive but meaningful process. And part of no surprises journalism is that we never write anything about anyone without them knowing the full extent of what we plan to say and give them a fair chance to comment. So with Jho Low, we've always offered him the full chance to comment for every article we've written. And same for the book. We reached out to his lawyers, maybe a year before the book came out, and with an extensive list of questions, extensive list of facts we plan to include, and we've asked for interviews many times. We just were never granted any access or any information whatsoever. I would say not so much as correcting or verifying his age. So that was the experience. So then, of course, as you all know, in the UK, there's the libel law has a kind of, it inspires a lot of fear in people. I think the actual law itself is less badly written than people perceive it to be. So instead, there was a very creative strategy. It's not by the first time it's ever used, but in anticipation of the book coming out, we started to receive a flurry of letters saying, we demand it not be published, we demand it not be published. And then just about 2 weeks before the book was coming out, Schillings wrote letters to every single independent bookstore and up to the independent bookstore up to Amazon.com in the world, as far as I can tell. I mean, I don't have the full picture, but definitely hundreds of letters. And they threatened to sue each and every single bookstore for defamation if they were to publish the book. The UK libel law actually has a very specific provision that says you may not sue a bookstore or a distributor of a book unless the judge is satisfied there is no other way to seek a remedy. Well, I'm based in the UK, so that's obviously one remedy, and also the publisher you could sue. But they still kind of went about this threat. And even in one case I saw that was particularly egregious, there was a Hong Kong bookstore. Initially, there wasn't that many bookstores in Hong Kong that would agree to take the book. And this bookstore just decided to go for it. It was at the airport. And Schilling started sending a letter to that bookstore every few hours. Like somebody was just delivering it. And in that one of the letters said, not only are you defaming our client, but you're potentially obstructing U.S. justice, which I thought was a particularly creative interpretation, that you would accuse a Hong Kong bookstore of potentially obstructing U.S. justice. It's obviously not true, but that was the strategy. There was other firms like that had a less ambitious approach, but there's this thing called the Barbara Streisand effect, or the Streisand effect, where she tried to prevent people from taking a picture of her villa in Malibu or something. And then, of course, everyone wanted to take pictures of it, and there was helicopters and stuff taking pictures of it. So it had the exact same effect for us. Perhaps 1MDB wasn't on everyone's minds, but then when they suddenly heard that this is a book that they don't want you to read, it became way more popular. And even in the UK now, there's some bookstores that are importing it. There's a lot of people here just buying it from Amazon.com, to have it shipped over. So. And also, I would say it had no effect on our reporting process. I mean, because they didn't even go so much as to deny a single fact, then they couldn't really influence the copy. I mean, we really wanted their involvement. We really wanted Jho Low's involvement. I'd love to sit down with Jho Low, so.
I just thought you might be interested to know as well that Schillings have also taken similar action against the book of Claire Rucastle Brown,
yes,
whose name you found very difficult to mention. Whose book is sold extensively in Malaysia and is on sale globally.
Yes.
Is the original story of this.
Of her experience. That's really what it's about. I agree. And we actually worked with Claire quite a bit during the book. We spent a lot of time together.
Just a minor question. Did I hear you right saying earlier on that Xavier was offered money by Sarawak Report? Or
well, no, she didn't have any money to offer herself, but she kind of said, look, you want to get money, I'll find people who have money who want to pay you for this information. So she essentially found these journalists, this editor, this wealthy publisher who had a newspaper in Malaysia, and he at least agreed to make the promise to pay the money, but he was never paid.
Okay, a second question, not to you, but the representatives of Schillings. Is there something that they might want to say about how they feel about representing somebody like Jho Low?
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much then, and feel free to come afterwards and ask me anything else you want to ask. Thank you.